Okay, we are to chapter 6, section 3. 6.3, which is the case 4. Case 4, government intervention. All right. So we divide, guys, we begin. We divide the arguments. In other words, what are the arguments for intervention? We divide them into two huge categories. The first one are political, and then economic arguments. So the first argument is called protecting industries. Protecting jobs. This is where they were saying, again, the proverbial Polish plumber who would go in Germany and steal the job of the German plumber. So this is related to protecting jobs. It's also, part of it is so-called unfair foreign competition. We already discussed that when you open for trade, your most uncompetitive industry will not be able to compete and will be likely suffer a lot of losses and major shrinkage. So one of the arguments is we need to protect the jobs and we need to protect the industry. Of course, this argument is partly correct. Yes, you can protect the industry, but if you open up, you will get other industry going on. I gave you the example early on with Bulgaria. Yes, when we opened up and joined the European Union, when we basically liberalized with the European Union, what we got is major losses in agriculture and a reduction in farming and agricultural jobs, but we gained a lot of jobs in tourism, okay? So you lose some, but you gain some other in some other place. And what politicians see is those screaming their jobs will get lost, but they don't see those who benefit, okay? We do benefit from cheaper agricultural prices. We do benefit from cheaper goods. Let's see what's number 2 political argument. Number 2, national security. And national security may be electronics, something that is very sensitive to electronics. It may be about national security, about, let's say, telecommunications, where you want to have your military to have control over telecommunications so that you're not dependent on a foreign government. National security may be associated with GPS and somehow using GPS and not being dependent on the United States, who can shut down the satellite and suddenly you can lose GPS and GPS positioning and all the other problems. National security might be, hey, you want to produce your own machine guns. You want to produce your own pistols. You want to produce your own explosive. You want to produce your own military equipment. So you want to produce and have industries to protect industries which are critical for your national defense, and you don't want to open yourself to competition who will destroy your own industry, and then your national security could be dependent on somebody else, okay? Well, for example, today, Germany believes that energy is critical for its national security, and therefore is trying to develop every possible source of energy so that it becomes relatively secure from Russia. Russia holds a key to a lot of the oil and gas resources in Europe. So that will be a legitimate argument of national security. The problem with the argument for national security is that very easy to claim anything you want to claim. Politicians, oh, this threatens our national security. For example, let's say, oh, we got a problem with cows and milk, and they say, this threatens the future of our children. Our children won't have food. They're going to starve. This is threatening the national security. So politicians like to use it, and they use it mostly incorrectly to the point where they actually abuse it. They use it for political arguments improperly and incorrectly. Another very, very common political argument is retaliation. Oh, they did something bad to us, we're going to do something bad to them. Politicians would love to use the retaliation argument because it usually appeals. They can find some group which suffered. They say, you see, this is what Russians did to us. Our whatever group is suffering because of the Russians. Now we got to do a trade to protect ourselves. We're going to retaliate to the Russians, and we're going to teach them a bad lesson. Or the Japanese, or the Chinese, or some other evil foreign country, or foreign economy, or foreign government. So politicians love to say, see what they did to us, now we're going to do the same to them. But of course, the argument is almost always they want to protect some local industry, and they're trying to find some other industry which has suffered, but they love to use the retaliation argument. And for the retaliation argument, they like to use what's called, and we discussed last time a little bit, punitive trade sanctions. Punitive trade sanctions. And sometimes the retaliation may be of the sort, oh, they're dumping certain amount of goods, they're dumping them and selling them so cheap, we're going to put special extra tariff, anti-dumping tariff, or countervailing tariff. Let's see what else we got. Retaliation, you have to understand, is very popular with politicians. It is very populist. It appeals a lot to the masses. But retaliation is extremely risky. You don't know that when you retaliate on something, they're not going to come back and retaliate on you. And then you got to retaliate again. And then it's a vicious spiral where retaliation calls for another retaliation, calls for a partner to retaliate, to the point where you completely shut down trade. And this is essentially what happened between the two world wars during the Great Depression. In the 1930s, the United States imposed the so-called Smoot-Holy Act, which imposed some tariffs on some foreigners that they thought was unfair competition. And the foreigners came back and said, oh, you're going to do this to us, we're going to do this to you. So foreigners raised their tariffs. And now America had to respond, and foreigners had to respond, to the point where during the Great Depression, or during that time, international trade completely collapsed because everybody raised their tariffs to the point where they said, oh, we're going to protect our industry, and in the process of everybody protecting themselves, everybody got hurt. The Great Depression literally hurt everybody, not only in Europe, but also in the rest of the world. So this is extremely dangerous, extremely risky strategy, and you just don't know how they're going to react, especially when they're big and powerful government, especially when they're a country like China, or like Japan, or like the US, or Great Britain, or why not France or Germany. You just don't know what's going to be the reaction to the retaliation. All right, number 4, consumer protection. Consumer protection is very popular amongst politicians, especially because it's populist, and in most of the times it actually is true and it's actually legitimate. And I have a number of examples. Consumer protection is usually from unsafe products. Now, let's provide a number of examples. Well, these are examples, not theory. Example is called mad cow disease. Is there such a disease? Yes, of course. Is it for real? Yes. Do people die? Yes. How or what causes mad cow disease? Well, this is when you feed your cows, you feed them with dead cows and meat of other dead animals. Well, cows are not supposed to eat meat, okay? Cows are herbivores. They're supposed to eat only grass. So, you feed them with the dead meat of other cows, they're gonna get sick, okay? So, if you feed humans with dead humans, humans are gonna get sick too. Question, yeah?
Sorry, I cannot read this.
Mad cow disease?
Mad cow disease.
Mad cow disease. It's a disease, you gotta go and search it if you haven't studied. You just gotta know what's a mad cow disease. It's well, in recent years, a very relatively common disease. It's a big, big danger, and it's usually when farm manufacturers, meat manufacturers, trying to make big profits. In other words, they are too greedy, they don't use sanitary conditions, and you use dead animal to feed the cows. And of course, they usually mince the meat, mix it up with a regular food, and the cow doesn't really understand that it's eating meat from other dead cows, okay? Of course, they're gonna flavor it and do all sorts of other terrible things. So yes, you may have a very legitimate argument for protection. Here's another one. Again, controversial for those in politics, but for those who understand or got a little bit of brain, it is very uncontroversial. It's hormone treated beef. They love to use it. It's called bovine hormone growth. Growth hormone. I made a mistake. Growth, BGH, bovine growth hormone, which you feed to the cows or to the cows or to the bulls, and they get to grow a lot bigger and a lot stronger and a lot faster. But guess what? When humans get to eat this meat, you get to grow in a similar way like a bull or like a cow, and you get to become bulky and all of those things. You get to, essentially, it totally messes up your hormonal system. Humans, you got hormones which regulate everything there is to regulate in your body, and hormones, all right girls, the two of you, yeah, enough, okay? We got about 15 more minutes. You're going to suffer. You can walk outside, and we're trying to explain to you that hormone and animals which are treated with hormone can totally destroy and ruin your health. And you got to stay far away from these. And when you got this kind of meat, it is better if the government will outright ban it, or at least it is better if the government will require that the meat is clearly stamped and designated as hormone treated, so that you, if you got enough brain, would choose not to eat it, and those who are stupid enough will choose to eat it, okay? It's up to them. So a government intervention in something as dangerous as this one is clearly beneficial. In general, you got the problem of, in general, growth hormones, and especially in cows. In cows, you got milk hormones, and these milk hormones can increase astonishingly milk output 10, 50, or 20 times from a cow. But they mess up the cow becomes sick and diseased, it gets to produce a lot of pus, and then the milk is toxic. If you know what kind of milk they produce with these hormones, you'll never drink milk again in your life, okay? It is a terrible thing. Another one is GMOs, genetically modified organisms, or sometimes they call them genetically engineered. And you got genetically engineered corn, genetically engineered wheat, genetically engineered rice, genetically engineered all sorts of things. Well, European Union has taken a very good stand against those and has pretty much prohibited them, okay, or at least requires some labeling, to the point where, according to American government, oh, these are perfectly safe. Well, how the American government knows that they're safe? The answer is the companies like Monsanto tell them, oh, they're safe because we did our own studies, and our own studies take it, concluded that it's safe. And the American government takes it for granted and believing, and in an attempt to defend its own industry, it accepts GMOs as equal or equivalent to regular food. Well, for anyone who's done any kind of study and research and has any interest, you will know and understand that GMOs can easily destroy your health in at least 100 different ways. Of course, it leads up to cancer, it leads up to multiple sclerosis, to Alzheimer's. You name terrible diseases, GMOs will cause it, okay? These are terrible things. So it's better outright that the government will just ban them, or if not ban them, at least to mandate clearly that these are labeled. So me as a consumer, if I care not to eat GMOs, that I can see that there is GMO corn, there is a GMO soy, there is a GMO whatever, and then I choose not to consume them. So here is another example when at least we know something is definitely damaging to the consumer, and that it's a very unsafe and unproven products. Yeah, if they want to sell them, okay, but tell me it's GMO and I'm not going to choose it. And if you don't care, you can eat them. Okay, and you got from here genetic and whatnot. Same thing with certain pesticides. Certain pesticides are known now to cause terrible, terrible damages, health damages, okay? Now they're known. I mean, maybe 20, maybe 30, maybe 40 years ago, it wasn't quite clear. But now they're known to cause. So, it's a good idea. Again, the same story. Either the government will outright ban it, or the government will clearly mandate labeling and say, use this type of pesticides, and then you decide if you want to have it or don't want to have it. So these are some examples of unsafe. Oh yeah, in China you guys got to remind me, toys. They were toys, and they were painted, I think, lead painted toys. Little toys that were painted with lead. And of course, lead is extraordinary toxin. It's called a neurotoxin. It messes up your brain. It can screw up a child in no time, okay? Especially a little boy or a girl between 1 and 4, you know, when they are still growing and developing. So you may have some lead, and of course, this is well known, it will lead to lead poisoning. It is well known to lead to lead poisoning. Now, if I remember, China had some problems with milk, powder milk or baby milk. Again, not all baby milk, only China had a particular problem at a particular point in time with bad child milk or baby milk, and that can cause huge problems. So, of course, the government has to be quite vigilant, and it is a legitimate reason or cause either for restricting trade, for banning it, or for forcing at least that it's properly labeled. Again, most people say, well, let them sell what they want to sell. Okay, fine, just label it, make it clear what it has or what it doesn't have, and we as consumers can probably choose. But sometimes the government would know lead is clearly poisonous, okay? It's clearly. So in this particular case, you don't need the decision and all those things. You just ban it outright, okay? So that's number 4. Number 5 will be foreign policy objectives. Foreign policy objectives. Sometimes governments will use trade policy to further their foreign policy objectives. And they talk about evil countries, about enemy countries. Well, you got to understand, which are enemies of America? Well, enemies of America are all those countries that don't want to play according to American rules. And American rules are made to favor America at the expense of their partners. So Cuba was one. They don't want to play according to American rules. So Cuba was considered to be enemy. Another one that didn't want to play according to American rules for 30, 40 years was Russia. So Russia was considered the major, the Soviet Union was considered a major enemy. For the last 20 years and maybe longer, Iran didn't want to play. So they considered Iran to be a major enemy of the U.S., okay? Another one that didn't want to play the game was Venezuela. Hugo Chavez stood up for his nation. Hugo Chavez was a statesman. He defended the interests of Venezuelans and stood up against the American government and major corporations. Talking about another one will be Libya and Muammar Gaddafi, right? He would also stand up and defend, for the most part, the interest of his own country. Now, some may say he was corrupt and other things, but he clearly, no, he may have been bad in some other ways, but he clearly stood up against America, against major American corporations, and against all the other international corporations that wanted to exploit Libya. Okay, he protected, for the most part, the interest of Libya. He did not sell his country out. Okay, so all of these would happen to be enemies of America, and all of these America will use trade policy, and we call these sanctions, trade sanctions, not to allow them to trade so that they can benefit from trade. Well, when we talk, and I was talking before about embargo. You impose an embargo on a country is basically, in a military sense, you limit the country from trading. Okay? You here impose a, let me see, I'm trying to remember the terms. One is embargo. You impose, another one is a trade sanctions. Again, you don't let them trade. So you have a large number of terms, I'm just trying to remember those of them, all of them, where you don't allow the country to trade, okay? And the country gets economically and financially hurt because of this. Okay, I'm going to come up with a few more a little later. So they call these countries, they got a special name. They call these rogue states. Rogue states. So rogue state is a state which doesn't play according to the rules of the West, you know, Iran, Venezuela, Libya, and so on. Okay, before Soviet Union, and so on. And number 6 is trade intervention to protect human rights. Human right protection is, oh, we need to stop trade because they are bad people. They usually do their other things and whatnot. This, again, is a totally bogus argument. When they don't like a particular a particular government for whatever reasons, they immediately say, oh, this government is a dictatorship. They treat their people terrible. They got human rights, and we have to intervene to protect human rights. Or the opposite, we got to stop the trade. We got to choke the government, okay? And by choking the government, you essentially, by choking the government, you essentially make the government weak to the point where their own people will overturn it. So these are all political arguments. Most of these arguments are usually abused. In other words, yes, foreign policy could be a legitimate argument, but it's usually not used legitimately. Human rights protection could be a legitimate argument, but most of the times is used totally inappropriately. Again, consumer protection is a very, very legitimate argument and should be used in legitimate cases, but a lot of times politicians love to use it in a very illegitimate way. Similar with retaliation, okay? It could be a legitimate argument, but most of the times when it's used in practice, it's usually in a bad and inappropriate way. Same thing with national security. Anything that disrupts the country, and they cry national security, big problem. It's going to destroy our country. For example, in Bulgaria, at one point they were even crying that destroying our agriculture was affecting our national security, as if we would be hungry because of it, and as if this will endanger the survival of the nation. Of course, that's not true, but that's how they presented it to us. And of course, protecting jobs in industry sometimes is a legitimate argument. Most of the times, it is not a legitimate argument because you see the one side, the losers, but you don't get to see easily or immediately who the winners are. And we got a few economic arguments. Number 1 is called infant industry. Let's use red. Infant industry argument. And the infant industry argument is that, oh, our industry is too young, we need to protect it, we need to let it stand on its feet, and then we will allow the competition to emerge. This is a very legitimate argument when the industry is genuinely infant and only when it is used in the very short term. In practice, 99% of these are a complete failure. 99% of it, as soon as you use the infant industry argument, 10 years down the road, you keep the protection. 20 years you keep the protection. 30 years you keep the protection. The infant is now a grown-up man, and it's getting old, and it's still weak, and it's still infantile, and it's still undeveloped, and it's still uncompetitive. So, as an argument in theory, it is beautiful and nice and could be correct, but in the real world, it is usually not good. It is always applied in the wrong, politically motivated manner. It is a good economic argument, but usually you got a lot of politics, and the infant industry is used instead of the protecting job and the protecting industry. Oh, we need to protect this industry. Let it grow a little bit, and then we'll let competition. For example, they say, oh, our shoes industry, not very good, let it grow, okay? And then 10, 20 years down the road, you always keep the protections. So in practice, it almost always is a disaster. Number 2 is, and I think that's the last one we're finishing, yes? Strategic trade policy. Strategic trade policy is about first mover advantage. The country can gain, and the government can gain, and the business can gain, and people and everyone can gain if the government can somehow help the industry to become first, to gain the first mover advantage against the rest of the competition. In other words, it provides a strategic help to a strategic industry or a strategic business, and this particular help really allows the industry to grow, to become one of the first in the world, and to reap the benefit for the whole nation, for employee. And that's a very legitimate argument as long as it is used properly and correctly. Now, anytime you got a new industry, they say, oh yeah, we need immediately. That's a strategic move. We need strategic trade policy. We need to support this industry. They immediately cry for more help from the government. So that's number 2. And that's it. I got only one more page, and that's the revised case. I already explained a lot about it. And let me see, revised case, page 230. And that's very simple. I already explained it. Retaliation is very risky and very dangerous because it can lead to a trade war. And trade war is an escalation of tariffs where one country tries to protect its own industry against foreigners. The other country responds. We respond again with higher tariffs in another industry. They respond in another industry. And this results in a complete breakdown of international trade. So you have to be very, very careful about retaliation. And you also have to be very careful about strategic trade policy because most of the time it doesn't work. And here is the other thing, that when you have a strategic trade policy or trade policy that usually benefits some particular groups, what happens is that national policy gets captured by those special interest groups, and these special interest groups get to milk and milk and milk, and basically the government becomes helpless against that very well organized particular group. Example of this will be sugar in the United States. Long time ago, the sugar lobby was able, with whether it's political corruption or bribery or however it was, power, to raise sugar tariffs and protect sugar prices on for the manufacturers, so that manufacturers can benefit a lot. And at the same time, the manufacturers will get subsidies at the same time. So they get to benefit twice. And now the sugar lobby will only perpetuate itself, and there is no way that you can stop and get what's called roll back all of those subsidies and protection. And now, today, almost 40 years later, the European Union suffers from exactly the same disease. Common agricultural policy sucks 40 to 50% of the European budget, and essentially it subsidizes European farmers. And instead of allowing for cheap food, food is the most expensive in Europe from everywhere in the world. It's cheaper in China, it's cheaper in Japan, cheaper in US, it's cheaper everywhere in the world. Europeans get to enjoy the most expensive food, and at the same time the farmers get not only the high prices but also get the high subsidies. So consumers lose twice, by paying the higher price one time and by paying the higher tax, which tax money goes to the farmers, and they just can't stop it. Europe has tried 1,001 different ways to roll back those subsidies in the common agricultural policy, and it just can't do it. It just can't stop. So it has been totally captured, and now the political system is helpless. And that's a dangerous or disastrous outcome that we will be paying for many years to come, at least those of you who live or who will live in Europe. Good enough for today? More than enough.